The first time David saw Mary again after 10 days of silence, she was live on stream, her hair styled to perfection, lips curled in that practiced fan service smile, blowing kisses toward the camera from the steps of a private jet. Behind her, standing smugly in designer sunglasses, was George, the rising idol whose fans called him Asia's fallen angel. And right beside them, on the side of the jet in bold silver script, were the words, "This one's for George, love, M." David stared at the footage in silence from the conference room of his company's 88th floor. Every screen in the room, from the receptionist's tablet to the assistant's smartwatch, had lit up with notifications. Livestream trending #1 in Asia. Fiancée of Tech Air sponsors Idol's tour jet, engagement, or escape. The press knew who paid for the jet. What they didn't know, what even Mary hadn't known, was that she had used his name to fund it. The expense report landed on his desk that morning, a $250,000 charge to the shared trust account. Filed under brand promotion. He hadn't even raised an eyebrow. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and listened. Through the glass walls, he could hear the muffled snickering of board members pretending to read their phones. Someone murmured, "Didn't she call him the love of her life just 2 months ago?" Someone else replied, "Apparently, the love of her life just booked George Ito front row tickets in Dubai, Paris, and Seoul." And then came the knife disguised as humor. "I'd be proud. She's sponsoring the arts." David smiled calmly, then picked up his phone and made one call. 10 minutes later, the jet in the stream shuddered mid-rollout and slowed. A man in uniform approached the camera with tight lips and a cancelled flight notice. The live stream cut abruptly. Mary's social media exploded, fans screaming, "Why was the flight stopped? What happened? Is George okay?" David stood, adjusted the cufflinks on his black tailored jacket, and looked down at the glittering skyline below. Chin Airways, the airline they'd partnered with to charter the jet, was now fully under his holding company. He didn't need to speak to Mary, he didn't need to shout, he had pressed one button and silenced an entire fandom. That night, while Mary scrambled to do PR damage control and George's studio issued apologies, a new headline broke across screens. Chin Holdings acquires majority stake in Chin Airways, effective immediately. Jet grounded mid-livestream due to restructured executive orders. And underneath it, a blurry paparazzi photo of David in his midnight suit, walking out of the shareholder meeting with a glass of wine in one hand and a blade of ice in his eyes. Later, a journalist tried to corner him. "Mr. David, any comments about the engagement, about Miss Mary sponsoring George's world tour?" David paused, he looked directly into the camera, then smiled. "Some people chase stars, I simply buy the sky they fly in." And just like that, the war had begun. David didn't believe in love. Not the version sung about in love songs or scribbled across greeting cards, not the kind that Mary used to romanticize with teary eyes and trembling fingers, flipping through photo albums like they were sacred texts. In David's world, love wasn't currency, it was collateral. And in their circle, collateral could always be replaced. Born into the Gu family, a dynasty synonymous with influence, clean acquisitions, and cold blood, David had grown up under the weight of expectations. His father didn't teach him to feel, he taught him to build, to calculate, to control. He was the only child who didn't cry when the family dog died, the only student in his class who ran a hedge fund simulation by 15. The only heir in his generation who looked at marriage not as a milestone, but a merger. Mary Lou was the best option at the time, daughter of the Liu conglomerate's CEO, media darling, trained in etiquette since birth, and beautiful in a way that made photographers tilt their lenses just slightly upward to make her look even more divine. The kind of woman who smiled at galas and knew the exact angle to hold her champagne flute for maximum elegance. But elegance didn't mean loyalty. The engagement had been announced 2 years ago at the International Investment Summit. A choreographed moment, flashbulbs, smiles, and a custom diamond ring that never left Mary's left hand. Unless she was on one of her solo trips. Back then, she had still looked at David the way one admired fine art, appreciation without intimacy. David, for his part, didn't care, he didn't need intimacy, he needed compliance. But Mary had a secret. A dangerous, stupid, glitter-drenched secret. His name was George Ito, an idol barely 5 years into the industry, pretty enough to sell tickets, emotional enough to sell dreams. Mary found him during one of her charity galas. He was perfect, arming as a surprise guest. After that, David began noticing subtle shifts. Her search history changed. Her phone buzzed more at night. Her social posts, always pristine, started including lyrics and vague captions. Some dreams are worth chasing, even if they burn you. David didn't say anything. He watched. He gathered. Receipts, transfers, brand endorsements quietly funded under private PR initiatives. He noticed how Mary had started withdrawing more from their shared fund, sums masked under vague labels like strategic sponsorships or celebrity outreach. But the numbers didn't lie. Over 3 million yuan had flowed from Gu Holdings to a web of shell accounts connected to George's studio. She thought she was being discreet. She didn't know David had installed a forensic accountant 2 months after their engagement, one of his quiet routines, along with quarterly asset audits and weekly shareholder sentiment reports. Emotional betrayal didn't break him. Operational betrayal did. Mary, for all her charm and beauty, wasn't a strategist. She was a dreamer, a fangirl who believed in shooting stars and redemption arcs. And George, he was a man who looked good under stage lights but blinked too much when reporters asked about taxes. David had seen it all before. He knew Mary thought she was cheating the system. She thought David was a placeholder, a tool, a corporate puppet held up for tabloids and engagement press kits while she lived out her true love fantasy on private jets and curated fan service moments. But tools don't own empires, toolmakers do, and David was a toolmaker. In the shadows of this drama stood Sarah, his executive assistant, hired personally after graduating top of her class from London Business School. She never wore perfume, never raised her voice, and never spoke unless spoken to. But she knew every move David made. She anticipated every outcome. She once took a call from the Prime Minister's office while managing a trade war crisis and still had coffee on his desk by 7:01 a.m. David didn't look at her twice. She wasn't part of the engagement, she wasn't part of the game, but she was watching. She knew where Mary had gone during her charity weekends, knew which hotel rooms George had checked into using company discounts, knew exactly how many NDAs Mary had violated in her desperation to elevate George's image, but she said nothing, because Sarah understood the game. David was grooming a war, not a marriage. The media still adored Mary. She was their China's sweetheart, even as whispers of her obsession began leaking through fan sites and anti-fan blogs. Some called it devotion, others, delusion. David let them talk. He let her trend. Until the live stream, until the jet, until she slapped the name M on something she didn't even own. The day before the live stream, David had signed the final paperwork acquiring Chin Airways' majority shares. Mary had unknowingly tried to use his new airline to fly her idol across a continent, broadcasting betrayal under his very nose. She thought she was bold. David found it laughable. Because she hadn't just betrayed a man. She had declared war on the man who held the very ground she stood on. And David wasn't the kind of man who screamed in heartbreak or cried over broken vows. He bought companies. He erased careers. He rewrote narratives. And in the center of it all, he stood like glass, transparent, cold, and deadly when shattered. In another office across the city, Mary was still radiant, still laughing, still telling her manager she'd handle David with a kiss and an apology. But this wasn't a romance, it was a takeover. And David was just getting started. The first hit didn't come from a scandal blog or backroom whisper. It came from the global finance gala. David arrived late, deliberately. His name was last on the guest sheet, despite his family being among the 4 founding patrons. That night, the ballroom was draped in obsidian and gold, champagne towers stacked like fragile dynasties waiting to fall. The moment he entered, all eyes shifted, but not toward him. They shifted past him, to the center of the crowd, where Mary stood laughing beside George, dressed in matching white, her in a satin backless gown, him in a tailored tuxedo with a silver lapel pin shaped like her initials. They weren't hiding, they were posing. The flashes weren't from press photographers, they were from influencer phones, from boardroom wives and up-and-coming socialites hungry for the next scandal. One glance at the live feeds confirmed it. Queen and idol number power couple. Mount M for Makoto. David's name was nowhere. But the whispers were everywhere. Didn't she get engaged to David last year? Wasn't the Gu family one of the sponsors tonight? Oh honey, haven't you heard? She's rewriting her own fairy tale. He didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, he made his way to the farthest table, near the silent auction wall, and casually picked up a pen to bid. A small bronze sculpture from the Tang dynasty. Useless. Symbolic. He signed the slip. 2.5 million. Just enough to outbid Mary's donation by 50,000. Later, the committee announced that David Gu had won the sculpture. The host called it a subtle nod of cultural preservation. Mary didn't look back, but George did. He met David's gaze from across the ballroom and smiled, not with confidence, with pity. That was the moment the switch flipped. The next morning, David entered the boardroom at 7 o'clock sharp. The directors were still groggy. His assistant Sarah had already prepared the quarterly forecast presentation and a full PR summary of the Gala scandal. He ignored both. Instead, he spoke one line. Move the Chixi Festival sponsorship from Ling Yue Group to Polaris Entertainment. There was a pause. One director frowned. But Ling Yue is, replace it, David said calmly, and freeze all pending ad placements on any streaming platform featuring George Ito. No press release, no announcement, just, stop. They obeyed. No one questioned him. 3 days later, George's agency lost 3 endorsement contracts due to budget realignment. 2 production meetings got rescheduled indefinitely, and a planned documentary about his rise to stardom was quietly shelved due to insufficient market demand. Mary didn't notice. She was too busy being interviewed on Morning Wealth Live, saying things like, "Love is freedom. I'm not just an heiress, I'm a woman with choices." Across the screen, George held her hand and grinned like he owned the world. David watched from his penthouse, the city blinking behind him like circuits waiting for orders. In the corner of the room, Sarah stood silently, arms folded. She didn't ask what came next. She didn't need to. The pressure began subtly, like a rising tide against a cliff. Mary's team started getting calls. Anonymous complaints filed against her foundation, tax discrepancies highlighted, permits for her next charity gala delayed for compliance review, logistics collapsed one by one, but never loud enough to make headlines, just quiet chaos. Mary's stylist quit. Her PR manager started sending resumes elsewhere. And still, she posted pictures with George, holding hands at rooftops, whispering during award shows, laughing over Parisian desserts. The caption on one read, "Real love doesn't need a reason. Hashtag just us. Let them talk." Let them talk. They did. They talked in salons and boardrooms, in whispered brunches and under their breath during brand meetings. It's admirable, really, chasing her idol like that. At least she's not pretending to be the perfect fiancée anymore. David must be too humiliated to show his face. He got played. David didn't respond. He didn't cancel the engagement either. Because this wasn't about her leaving. This was about her using his name, his assets, his network, to sponsor someone beneath her, someone who believed celebrity could ever rival inheritance. At a social banquet hosted by the Jung Group, David made a rare appearance. He didn't bring Mary. Instead, Sarah stood beside him, not in a gown, but in an executive suit, minimalist heels, and a face void of vanity. She poured his wine, whispered in his ear, smiled only when necessary. The crowd didn't know what to do with her. She wasn't a beauty, but she wasn't a fool. And when the chairman's wife leaned over to ask, "Who is that with David?" someone whispered, "His shadow." 1 week later, George's mother went to the hospital due to stress complications. Mary was seen sobbing outside the ER. Paparazzi caught the moment perfectly. But instead of sympathy, the netizens turned. She dragged him into the limelight, and now he's paying for it. Didn't she say she'd protect him? Look at him now. She's ruining his life to act out her fantasy. David didn't say a word. But his lawyers did. A quiet notice was sent to Mary's legal team, a motion to dissolve their joint fund. All shared assets would be liquidated, account activity blocked pending review. She called him 12 times. He picked up on the 13th. Her voice trembled. "David, what are you doing?" He didn't raise his voice. "Correcting a mistake." You don't understand, George, he's going through so much, because of you. David interrupted flatly. And my name. She fell silent. Then, breathlessly. You're really going to do this to me, to us? David laughed quietly, bitter and elegant. There is no us, Mary, there never was. Click. The next morning, Mary trended again. But this time, the headline read, Jew Holdings announces dissolution of financial ties with Mary Lou. No comment on personal matters, all business decisions remain internal. And below it, an image of David at a rooftop meeting, Sarah standing just behind him, tablet in hand, eyes trained on the horizon. Mary stood alone, George was missing from her side. And for the first time, even the fans began to ask, was it all worth it? David didn't answer. He was already busy setting the next domino in motion. David sat at the edge of the rooftop helipad, wind tousling his dark hair, his blazer fluttering against the concrete seat like something trying to fly away. Below him, City A sprawled out, steel, neon and silence. The city looked alive, it always did, but tonight, it looked like it had turned its back on him. Or maybe, he had turned his back on it first. Inside the GU building, the legal team was still processing the separation filings. The dissolution of the joint fund, the severing of public and private contracts tied to Mary. Every asset down to the shared Cartier watch she gifted him for PR shoots had been accounted for and frozen. On paper, he was methodical, controlled. But behind the calm, something burned. He remembered her hands when they first met, cold from champagne, but soft. She had smiled up at him like a rehearsed ballet dancer, tilted just right, lashes fluttering like curtains about to reveal a lie. Back then, David believed she was just like him, caged in expectation, loyal to optics. He thought she'd be a capable ally. She was never meant to be a lover, but she wasn't meant to be this reckless either. The betrayal wasn't in the jet, it was in the audacity, in the way she whispered George's name like a prayer, in the way she said, real love doesn't ask permission. David didn't cry. He didn't scream. He calculated. He remembered his grandfather's words. If you want to destroy someone, don't take their life, take their narrative, make the world see them the way they truly are. And so David started with her image. He had torn down idols before, Mary and George would be no different. The next morning, Sarah entered his office silently. She held a folder, reports from the internal team tracking Mary's online image collapse. Her face was tight, she placed it on the desk, but he didn't look at her. Instead, he stood facing the window, one hand in his pocket, the other tightening around a cufflink she had gifted him on his birthday, a cufflink with G+M engraved on the back. She thought he hadn't noticed the initials. Sarah said quietly, "The brands are pulling out, 4 more this morning." He didn't respond. She hesitated. "Do you want me to pause the campaign?" David turned slowly, eyes sharp but empty. "Why?" Sarah straightened. "Because you haven't eaten in 32 hours, and because this isn't about business anymore." He looked at her, really looked at her. And for a moment, something flickered. But it was gone just as quickly. "Keep going." Sarah nodded. She didn't flinch. But as she turned to leave, a silent tear trailed down her cheek. She wiped it away before the door shut. That evening, David attended an art exhibition sponsored by Polaris Media. George was there, of course. Holding Mary's hand, surrounded by influencers, paparazzi, and faded nobility pretending they still mattered. Mary wore red, George wore black. Together, they looked like rebellion dressed in silk. David stepped into the room, a storm in tailored charcoal. Silence followed him. Mary's smile faltered when their eyes met. George stepped in front of her like a shield. David said nothing. He moved past them, but George called out, "You think money makes you invincible, David?" David stopped. The room froze. George continued, "You think you can destroy people just because they don't want to play your game?" David turned back, slow and deliberate. "I don't destroy people," he said coldly. "I just let the truth do its job." George's jaw tightened. "Mary never loved you." "I know," David replied. He stepped forward, unblinking. "But did you know the plane she chartered for you was paid for through my holding company?" That every fan gift you posted came from my executive fund disguised through PR agencies? That your first international tour, that was approved through my board vote. You were a charity case long before you became her fantasy. Gasps echoed around them. Someone dropped a wine glass. George clenched his fists. You act like you own everything. David's voice dropped to a whisper, laced with lethal calm. You're gold, George. Flashy, eye-catching, easy to melt. But me? I own the gold mine. Mary stepped forward, her eyes wide. You don't have to humiliate him. David's eyes didn't even flick to her. This isn't about humiliation. This is about correction. Hours later, alone in his apartment, David stood at the balcony overlooking the city again. Everything below had been touched by his hand, funded, mapped, predicted. And still, a part of him whispered something dangerous, something emotional. He silenced it. Behind him, a soft knock at the door. Sarah entered, carrying a tray. Plain soup, 2 slices of toast, a flask of warm ginger tea. She placed it on the coffee table, set the utensils quietly, and adjusted the tray with care. David didn't thank her. He didn't even look at her. He just said, "Stay." And she did. Not for reward, not for recognition, but because she understood the truth. Some betrayals are loud, but some are earned silently. And David had learned, loyalty isn't proven through vows, it's proven in silence, in the shadows, in staying. As Sarah sat across from him, reading her documents while he ate in silence, the storm inside him finally quieted. Just for a moment. Not because he was healing, but because his revenge plan was nearly complete. The scandal broke on a Tuesday. A leaked document, an anonymous insider tip, spread across Weibo, Twitter, and international tabloids like wildfire. It was a procurement contract, bearing Mary Lou's signature, transferring millions in unapproved funds from a non-profit fund to shell corporations tied to George Ito's studio. What made it explosive wasn't just the amount, it was that the fund belonged to the Liu Women's Foundation, an organization Mary's family had proudly co-sponsored for over a decade. Suddenly, all those fan giveaways, extravagant birthday billboards, private concerts, designer outfits, and curated content were not just romantic gestures, they were potentially fraudulent. Within 6 hours, Mary's name trended for all the wrong reasons. Mary Lou embezzlement, #fan love or fraud, #celebrity slush fund. George tried to release a statement, his studio posted a shaky apology blaming internal mismanagement. But the screenshots kept coming. The dates matched, the amounts matched, the intent was clear. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was love, paid in other people's money. David didn't say a word. Instead, he walked onto a red carpet that same night, one he had originally declined to attend. It was a corporate tech gala, the kind of event normally closed to entertainment media. But this time, a rumor had leaked, David Gu would appear with a new guest. And the media came swarming. Flashes exploded as he stepped from the black Rolls-Royce, the car door opened on the other side, and Sarah stepped out, not in her usual sharp suit but in a fitted black satin dress, minimalist makeup, and heels that turned her into an exclamation point of elegance. There was no hand-holding, no fake smiles, just precision. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The moment David extended his hand, silently, and Sarah placed hers on top, every headline wrote itself. David Gu's new Muse app. Pairs. Executive assistant, or power couple in the making. Gu Holdings sends silent message at Gala. And Mary? She watched the photos from behind a locked dressing room door. She was scheduled to appear on a brand livestream that night, but the moment she stepped into the studio, the brand pulled out live on camera. The host scrambled to fill time. Mary was escorted out the back exit like a disgraced intern. No camera followed, just whispers. Just her phone buzzing, calls from her mother, from the Liu family's lawyers, from George, who was now being summoned to meet the ethics board of his entertainment company. Because if it was true that the slush fund payments were illegal, and George had benefited knowingly, his endorsements could vanish overnight. And vanish they did. One by one, deals began evaporating. Dior paused his campaign. His fan club deleted their official site. His sponsorship with an energy drink dropped him in a now viral statement. We do not support emotional manipulation or financial misconduct, regardless of status. George smashed a wine glass against the wall, His apartment, formerly paid for by Mary, was now filled with unopened letters from agencies demanding repayment. He called her, screamed. "You said you had everything under control." Mary sobbed. "I didn't know this would happen. You told me it was okay. I told you to support me, not rob a charity. But I did it for us." George laughed bitterly. "There is no us if I lose my entire career." The next morning, tabloids caught Mary entering George's building and leaving alone. Makeup smudged, paparazzi caught the tears, but no one posted them with sympathy. Under the images, the comments were brutal. "She played with fire. Now she wants a tissue? Justice served, she can cry in jail next." Meanwhile, the Liu Corporation faced its first major investor pullout in over a decade. Anonymous tips to regulators exposed irregularities in several of Mary's family-linked foundations. Audits were ordered, tax records were frozen. And at the center of it all, sitting silently in a cafe across from the city courthouse, David stirred his espresso while Sarah read the next batch of headlines out loud. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. But when she looked at him and whispered, "It's all falling exactly where you placed the dominoes," David replied only, "This isn't revenge, it's recalibration." By week's end, George received a formal ban from 4 major networks. His face was removed from promotional banners. His scenes from a drama were reshot with a replacement. His fans began turning on him. He used her and ruined her. So much for love. He bailed fast. George punched a wall and fractured 2 fingers. He wouldn't be playing guitar on his next tour, if there ever was one, but the real blow hadn't landed yet. At the quarterly shareholders meeting of GU Holdings, David announced a merger acquisition with Liu Tech, one of the Liu family's oldest and most stable subsidiaries, not through hostile takeover, through cooperation with their competitors. Within hours, half of Liu Tech's executive board resigned. The company's stock plummeted. Mary's father was admitted to the hospital for hypertension. George tried to rally public sympathy by posting a late-night video of him singing a ballad in tears. It received 37,000 dislikes in an hour. And in the background of all of it, David didn't post once. He simply appeared, in interviews, in acquisition headlines, on financial talk shows, praised for his incredible timing and masterful market positioning. Sarah remained by his side, always calm, always in black. No smiles, no claims, just presence. One night, at a formal art gala, someone asked him off camera, "Is it true you orchestrated the scandal?" David simply sipped his wine and replied, "I didn't orchestrate anything, but I'm very good at being patient." While people hang themselves. Behind him, Sarah adjusted the edge of his collar, and Mary. She was last seen crying alone outside the headquarters of a law firm, her makeup running, her phone dead. Someone recorded a blurry video of her muttering, "Tell David I didn't mean for it to end like this." It never even trended. Because by then, no one cared. David had rewritten the narrative. And this time, he was the only author. The ballroom shimmered under the chandeliers of the Arclight Pavilion, cameras stationed at every angle, lenses ready to capture history. Tonight was the highly anticipated Chin Phoenix Tech merger press conference, one of the biggest corporate events of the year. CEOs, influencers, investors, and foreign dignitaries filled the velvet seats, sipping on vintage champagne while whispering about stocks and scandals. But none of them expected this kind of show. David Gu walked in last. As always. He wore a deep charcoal 3-piece suit, no tie, shirt collar slightly open, like he had nothing left to prove. His black-gloved hand rested gently over his silver pocket watch, his grandfather's, timeless, silent, unshakable. Beside him, Sarah, in black silk again, minimalist, flawless posture, no expression. The cameras turned instantly, microphones extended. They didn't bother asking questions. David never answered them on red carpets, he only answered on stage. The moment he took the podium, the room fell into reverent quiet. David tapped the mic once. His gaze swept the crowd, but it landed and held on 2 people standing in the back, trying to blend in behind a row of chairs. Mary and George. Mary was pale under the lights. Her once glamorous curls were pinned up in a messy bun, and she wore an outdated designer coat as if clinging to an identity no longer hers. George was in a suit, but not one tailored. It wrinkled at the sleeves, bagged at the shoulders, and he looked like a man trying to wear power, like a costume. David's mouth curled. "Before I begin, allow me a moment of acknowledgement," he said, voice calm and composed, carrying through the speakers. "To the former fiancée who mistook obsession for love, and to the idol who mistook sponsorship for success." The crowd froze. Whispers erupted like sparks in dry grass. George's face turned crimson. He stepped forward. "You think this is your stage?" David didn't even blink. "It always was, you just thought the lights were for you." Mary clutched George's wrist. "Don't, George." But he yanked away. "No, he doesn't get to act like he's God." George stormed toward the stage, pushing past rows of chairs. Cameras flashed, journalists rose to their feet. Security hesitated, unsure. David remained still. George pointed a trembling finger. "You ruined our lives." "I exposed what you did with them," David corrected coolly. "You made the choices, I simply gave them lighting." George's voice cracked. "You leaked everything, the donations, the companies, the damn charity fund." David's jaw tightened. "You mean the fund Mary laundered for your gifts? Or the sponsors you begged to accept Mary's name while I footed the bill? Or maybe you mean the directors you seduced with fake numbers to get your documentary funded?" Each word struck like a scalpel. Mary whispered, "David, please stop." But David's eyes were on George. "Do you know what the difference is between a simp and a king, George? A simp gives everything and ends up with nothing. A king waits and ends up with everything." The room fell into stunned silence. And then George snapped. With a roar, he lunged, swinging his fist toward David's face. The crowd gasped. Sarah moved, fast, stepping in front of David like a silent shield, but David gently placed a hand on her arm. "No need," he said softly. He caught George's wrist mid-swing with one gloved hand, held it effortlessly, and leaned in, voice like ice over broken glass. "You couldn't land a punch in business, George. What made you think you'd land one here?" George's rage boiled. "You bastard!" But before he could wrench free, the doors to the ballroom burst open. Police entered. 2 officers approached quickly, flashing badges. "George Ito," one officer announced, "you're under arrest for financial misconduct, defamation, and obstruction in a federal audit investigation." Gasps rippled across the ballroom. Cameras clicked furiously. George's face drained of color. "What? What? You can't do this!" Mary screamed. "Wait, you can't, he didn't mean..." But the officers already had George in cuffs, walking him out past the guests. His screams echoed against the chandeliers. "David, you did this. This is you." David turned back to the mic calmly. "Correction. This is you, just, finally in focus." Mary stood frozen in the aisle. Mascara streaked her cheeks. She didn't say a word as David stepped down from the podium and walked straight toward her. She flinched, but he stopped inches away, then spoke so only she could hear. "You thought I was the placeholder. But the truth is, I never wanted to marry you. The Gu family doesn't marry liabilities. It absorbs them, then dissolves them." Mary's lip trembled. "Why didn't you just leave me?" David's expression didn't change. "Because leaving is mercy, and you never gave me that." He turned. Sarah was waiting beside the exit, unreadable as ever. David didn't look back. The ballroom parted like waves as he walked through it, untouched, unchallenged. Behind him, Mary collapsed into a chair, silent sobs racking her body. And the cameras? They didn't follow her anymore, they followed him. That night, headlines exploded. George Ito arrested at live corporate event, leaked ties to fraud scandal confirmed. David Gu breaks silence, one sentence ends the Queen Idol saga. Sarah Zhang identified as new Gu Holdings public liaison, not a girlfriend, not a secretary, a strategist. The next morning, Sarah placed a document on David's desk. It was the final market report. Gu Holdings stock was up 11%. Liu Corporation's shares had been suspended from trading. David didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Sarah quietly turned to leave. But before she reached the door, he spoke. "Dinner. Tonight. You pick the place." She turned, surprised. "For business?" David glanced up from his reports. "No," he said, then paused. "For balance. And maybe, just maybe, That was the closest he'd ever come to peace. Because this war, this performance, this orchestrated destruction, it wasn't about pain, it was about control. And now that everything was in pieces, he still stood, untouched, unshaken, crowned. The once glorious Liu Corporation now sat beneath a flickering sign, its nameplate tarnished, its lobby deserted. Mold crept into the corners of the marble floor that had once hosted foreign investors and luxury CEOs. Now, it held the faint scent of cold instant coffee, desperation, and dust. Behind the scratched reception desk sat Mary, draped in an oversized beige coat that no longer screamed designer but second-hand. Her makeup was gone, her lashes, real, her lips, dry, her phone battery long since dead. She tapped at a cracked laptop, pretending to type, pretending there was still a job to do. Across from her sat George, no longer in his flashy sunglasses or velvet jackets, just a hoodie, wrinkled, anonymous, cancelled. He flipped through an outdated contract, lips muttering figures that no longer mattered. His fingers bore faint scars, reminders of the champagne bottle he once crushed in rage, and of the career that shattered with it. A soft knock came at the glass door. They both flinched. But it wasn't a creditor. It wasn't a fan. It wasn't the press. It was David Gu, in all black. A trench coat draped across his shoulders like a shadow that had never really left them. His figure reflected in the glass like a phantom, and then he pushed the door open, slow, deliberate. The rusted bell overhead jingled like a funeral chime. Mary stood up too fast, knocking over her paper cup. Her voice broke like a dam. David. He didn't speak. He looked around the shell of their former empire, the peeling Liu logo on the wall, the dust settled in corners that used to be scrubbed by polished shoes and maids in heels. George stood too, his hands clenched, breathing sharp, but there was no fire left, just bitterness. You came to gloat? George asked. David's eyes barely brushed over him. I came to see the end of a chapter. Mary stepped forward, her voice trembled, but her eyes glowed. Istinid. David, I know I was foolish, but we were all young. His gaze silenced her. Frozen. She kept going, voice cracking. I made mistakes, yes, but you were always calm, always in control. Please, say something. David exhaled quietly. His words landed like a bullet. You're not even worth my memory. Mary's face collapsed, her mouth opened, then closed. George stepped forward, hissing, You think you're above it all, don't you? David tilted his head slightly, one brow rising. I don't think. I prove. George lunged again, but this time, the swing died mid-air. His own body gave up before it reached David. David didn't flinch, he turned, and walked out, without a word, without a backward glance. That night, across the skyline of City A, Gu Holdings announced a full acquisition of Orion Cybernet, the final piece in its cross-continental tech expansion. It was a move that secured David's position as the youngest figure to control a 5-sector multi-continent empire. He didn't attend the celebration. He didn't need to. The world celebrated him anyway. In a polished glass tower, miles above the filth of Liu Corporation's bones, Sarah stood quietly at the far end of the executive boardroom. A new assistant handed her a list of interview requests: Forbes, Bloomberg, Vogue Business. She declined all of them. Mr. Gu doesn't do press, she said plainly. And you, Ms. Zhang? Sarah's eyes flicked upward. I'm not a story. Weeks passed, seasons shifted, the city forgot Mary, forgot George. New scandals took the spotlight, new idols rose, the digital world moved on. But some ghosts never stopped haunting the living. One rainy morning, a video surfaced online, blurry, grainy. It showed Mary sitting on a street curb, staring at a bus stop poster of David, clean-cut, powerful, unbothered, a new campaign for an education initiative. He wasn't smiling, he never needed to. She murmured something to herself. The only audible word? David. But this time, he didn't reply. Because ghosts don't respond to what's already buried. Far above that city, on the top floor of Gu Tower, David stood alone, hands tucked in his coat pockets, looking down at the glass he now owned. Beneath him were ruins. Behind him, empire. And somewhere in between, nothing. Sarah approached, holding a new acquisition file. Shall I begin negotiations with the bait group? David looked away from the window. Begin, but don't close. Sarah paused. Why? He turned fully, voice like ice carved from silence. Because legacy isn't just built. It's measured by what you don't need to buy anymore. She nodded, leaving the room. He turned back to the window, city lights flickering below like stars that had surrendered. There was no love here, no redemption, no victory speech, only silence, only control. And in that silence, David Gu had everything. And everyone else had only the memory of him. Which, as he made perfectly clear, was no longer theirs to keep. Not even worth remembering.